Hello, everybody. Welcome to the first inaugural episode. Now, today, I'm going to be talking about the courage to be disliked among a variety of other things as a recovering people pleaser. And yes, as you might have imagined, if you're somebody who is either in the online self-help space or just generally well-read, there is a book that is sort of circulating in a lot of these spaces called The Courage to be Disliked, co-written by two Japanese authors, which I also find very interesting in light of the fact that the psychology they tend to lean on is, I believe, an Austrian psychologist, Adler. And Adler was known as one of the three, I suppose, giants is how they refer to him in the book. And he basically had a different approach compared to Jung and Freud, who were the other two giants of that time. Now, Jung is best known, especially in self-help spaces, as the psychologist who is very much focused on self-actualization, integration of the shadow, as well as a variety of archetypes that one might identify with. And Freud, as many are probably familiar from one way or another, he's best known for psychoanalysis and predominantly looking how one's past influences one's future. Now, Adler very much did not care for that type of mentality, and he basically thought that what was most important was not what happened to us in the past in an ideological sense, which, if you're unfamiliar with the term, it means, it's sort of source-based, cause and effect-based. He basically was thinking more so the value we assign to different phenomena that have happened to us is what matters. Now, this is not a foreign concept by any means. People talk about the power of positive thinking. That is a very common thing. People talk about controlling one's mindset. They talk about manifestation. Honestly, if you look anywhere within the self-help space, you'll certainly find a whole variety of approaches saying very, very similar things. That basically you are the, not necessarily, manifester or creator of your own destiny in some ways, and whatever thought that you hold in your mind is sort of self-fulfilling. It's going to be a self-fulfilling prophecy, and you can take that in a variety of directions, whether you want to have that originate in science, if you want that to originate in spirituality, if you want that to originate from somewhere else. There are various approaches that sort of arrive at a similar conclusion. And I think what was most interesting about this book in particular, despite my perusal into this space, when it comes to this type of content, I've sort of been everywhere and anywhere. I am absolutely a recovering people pleaser and definitely think or have thought for some time it had a lot to do with, again, from a sort of psychoanalytical perspective, diving into my past, it had a lot to do with how I was raised and my surroundings at the time and the environment. And I thought that those were immutable, right? Unchangeable. And it was so interesting coming from a different perspective and saying, actually, the locus of control might be within myself. And I may not be, as unideal this word is, I'm not a victim to my circumstances. I am a co-creator in regard to my circumstances. And I find that very interesting because even as I have embarked on a new career within the last year, there have been times where I have been so overwhelmed and frustrated by my work environment that I have found myself saying, I will not be a victim to this environment. I will not be a victim to my circumstances. I sort of took it as an embodiment of spite or resistance or some sort of fortitude in the face of adversity, when in reality, based on Adler or these authors in this book, I'm actually the co-creator of this situation. So I found that very interesting, and I wish it were more intuitive, and I imagine it's fairly intuitive for others. However, I tend to struggle with that, and I don't know if it's because I've had a tumultuous relationship in some ways, or you could call it rocky or up and down, whatever way you want to say it. Maybe tumultuous is a little bit dramatic, with the concept of faith. And I think struggling to believe that there's something greater than me that has a vested interest in my well-being is something that I've had difficulty with. And I had a pretty profound sense of faith when I was much younger. And I remember when I was even in middle school, I would encourage the other girls before a sports game to pray with me to hope that we would win, things like that. Not that I was particularly religious or devout in the sense of being so demonstrative and going through all the motions and ritualistic. It was really not that. I just, for some reason, felt as though I had a one-to-one relationship with, I guess, at that point, how I considered it to be God. I very much did. I would pray all the time. I just kind of relied on that belief to get me through a lot of things, and believing that no matter what, I could talk to this being. And I think as time ticked on and as life got harder and life got, I suppose, worse in a lot of ways, as you carry more responsibility, then when things happen to you, it can be all the more difficult. And I lost some of the resiliency that I had in childhood. I think that, unfortunately, that relationship sort of, I don't want to say soured, because it implies that there are two actors on both sides, and I wouldn't necessarily fault a higher power in the way that I would, fault either myself for the change in my mindset, but my mindset certainly shifted, and I just didn't have that belief to rely on anymore. And I think as a result of that, I turned more into myself. And what's interesting is, as I sort of referenced earlier, when it comes to Adlerian thought and psychology, him turning the locus of control onto oneself, right? I guess I sort of did that and then started to blame myself for everything. And while I'll get back to my initial point when it comes to Adler and the positivity that comes with sometimes gaining more control over your situation, I'll walk you through the rest of this path and how I actually ended up in this place in the first place, in case it brings anybody any insight or similar to somebody else. So essentially, I turned more inwards towards myself and started to, believe that I was the only actor in my life. And unfortunately, since I didn't have this other outlet, and unfortunately, fortunately or unfortunately, just was the way it was, I didn't have a social support system in my life, familial or otherwise, to be there for me. And if anything, there was some added stress, I think, also from these individuals. And as a teenager going through that time and having a lot of, let's say, academic, interpersonal, athletic pressures, it was a struggle for sure. And I didn't know how I would make it through, to put it delicately. And I think the pressure all the more came from the fact that, and I guess I keep saying this in different ways, I just couldn't place any part of it on anybody because they would make it worse. And that's not just an artificial construction. That is not just something that my brain came up with. That is, unfortunately, or whatever, I keep putting value judgments on it, but that just was the reality. And as, what came to manifest is, it wasn't diagnosed formally in any which way, but I certainly was having a difficult time, as you might imagine, and as you might have experienced yourself as well. If you're going through something and you're completely alone, social support is one of the pillars of life, to be quite frank. And I know it's not referenced all of the time. People always say food, water, shelter, but social support is a biggie, especially given the fact that we are human beings. We are social creatures. We are interpersonal creatures. And that is just science, baby. That is just evolution. That is just reality. We wouldn't have become such predominant organisms on this planet had it not been for cooperation. That just is what we are, to be quite honest. We're social beings. And you can see as well, our physical form is not formidable in any sense when it comes to other animals, other organisms out there. we really don't measure up physically. And so it's that cognitive, the ratio of the brain to the rest of the body. And, a lot of those centers have to do with cooperation, a lot of those emotions. Anywho, I'm sort of running away with that. But it does sort of tie back, I suppose, to where I found some reprieve. So I turned inward towards myself, blamed a lot of things on myself. I didn't pray. I didn't unload any of that on anybody else. I didn't process any of that. If something bad happened, I would either think that it was just bad luck, or I would assume that I did it. And more often than not, others would also say that I was to blame, whether or not now, looking back in hindsight, that was true. And as you might imagine, what that would do to somebody who still has a fairly developing neuroplastic mind as a young teenager, it didn't go so great. Now, I was lucky enough to attend a fairly distinguished university and continue to develop there. And unfortunately, I keep saying that. It gets better, guys. When I got there, I think I had another shift in identity, I suppose, where I all the more started to, how can I put this? When I was in high school, I would still perform, even if internally I did not feel as though I could sustain it or I could validate myself. I couldn't socially support myself, and I didn't have that elsewhere. Yeah. When I went away for college, it was all the more so, right? Because now I was surrounded by strangers, some of which were presenting in ways that I'd never experienced before, right? They're cooler, they're richer, they're smarter, they're more athletic, they're more beautiful, they're everything that I wasn't. Yeah. And not to say that I didn't assign those values to myself. I suppose I sort of did, which is why I guess it made it even worse that I was coming from a smaller pond and entering what presumably was more so of a lake or an ocean or a bay, whatever you want to say. And I really wasn't prepared for that, especially given how much I relied on myself for everything and didn't have much more that I could give. I had no more reserves. And then I lost the structure of high school and was given so much more latitude and freedom that without the rigidity and without the necessity of having to perform and push to that capacity of having no reserve, I then just ceased to do so. And towards the tail end of my university time was when I came across a variety of courses that I really, really enjoyed. And they changed my life. They changed my life philosophy. And that is sort of through this long story where I'm getting you to now. So what these courses introduced me to was the concept of evolutionary psychology. Now, I understand that somehow in pop culture and media, it's gotten a bad rap. And I think that's had to do with a lot of more public figures leaning on it. And as a result, clips of it being taken and co-opted by various individuals with various, not just political agendas, maybe personal agendas, but certainly narrative agendas, where they want to present certain information in one way. And who's to say that I'm, not doing that? I feel like everybody does, right? We're all individual people that have different perspectives, and not to say I'm any different from them, but it's more that when something that is so nuanced becomes so simple or reduced, I think you lose a lot of its dynamism, you lose a lot of its intrigue and power, and to be quite honest, usefulness. So I found evolutionary psychology, when formally taught, to be very, very interesting and very helpful. Essentially, what it did for me is it externalized all of those things. So I didn't have a higher power, I didn't have a faith, but what I did have was science. And I was able to take all of these things that I told myself because other people told me these things, that I was lazy, that I couldn't work hard, that I had all of these issues, I wasn't disciplined, all of these narratives that I had going on in my life, that I, was anxious when it came to hanging around people. I was like a little afraid of new people, whatever it was, right? Like things that are fairly benign human traits, human characteristics that are fairly universal. I was taught about their origins and how they would serve a human back then, right? Would serve a Homo sapien, right? Like it would serve us evolutionarily. It was adaptive. And once seeing my tendencies that had been so regarded, again, both by myself as well as others, predominantly nuclear family, as character flaws, when those character flaws were instead determined to be the result of millions and millions of years of evolution, I cannot tell you the weight that was lifted off of my shoulders. It was honestly, it was life-changing, as I said earlier. And I took more and more classes just to learn more about these undercurrents of human life, because so many of us walk around and are blissfully unaware. And it's not to say that, maybe all of this is a simulation. We can't entirely write that off. But it is very interesting in some ways to take note of what this evolutionary matrix is. And it's a biological matrix, which I think is so interesting because, we use that term matrix when it comes to skin, like cellular matrix. Anywho, it's just very fascinating, right? Because it all ties to that movie. But the underlying tune at the heart of humanity, I guess I shouldn't say humanity, that implies more social workings, but I guess humankind really is this evolutionary psychology, evolutionary biology. And granted, my major was one of the evolutionary biologies that we had available. However, this was the intersection I wanted. My secondary degree was in psychology, and so this was the perfect integration between these things. And I didn't realize how empowering and enriching it would be for me, and how stabilizing it would be for somebody who had walked the earth up to that time as a young adult into their early 20s, believing that there was something fundamentally wrong with them. There was something fundamentally wrong because my life experience was different from those around me. I was different from those around me. I thought there was something fundamentally wrong with me because I got nervous when I walked into a room, or I cared when this person didn't like me. And all throughout my life, all throughout my adolescence, my childhood, I had been told you were too sensitive. I had been told you need to ignore them, be the bigger person, etc. And I was unable to do those things. I was unable to arrive to certain places exactly on time. I was unable to stop procrastinating. I was unable to do so many things that to those around me seemed simple. And as a result of that, I was considered to be these labels, these sort of character judgment, these character flawed labels. And what can you do when that's the narrative that you're surrounded by, other than metabolize them and internalize them? Especially if you don't have this higher being, this higher consultant to talk to lean on, to basically say, hey, this can't be right? You have no other validation. Now, after learning all about the various parts, I would say, or facets of evolutionary psychology, how birth order plays, and this is all, again, backed in scientific papers. There's literature for this, right? And not to say that all literature is the same. We can always go into validity of various scientific publications and how big their sample size was, the statistical power, things like that, right? If they have any biases when it comes to sponsorships. There's so many different ways that one needs to interpret a paper, and just being published doesn't necessarily mean everything in the world. It's often, meta-analyses and the conglomerate, the consolidation of various conclusions that can be most helpful. However, these were the result of those things. And despite evolutionary psychology being a burgeoning field on the cusp in a lot of ways, especially when I was in college, it brought me a lot of stability in saying that, hey, there are in-group and out-group dynamics, which is part of the reason why when you feel excluded, it feels horrible. Like, period, right? That's it. There's a scientific basis for these things, because back in the day when we were in tribal groups, if you did not conform, you would be ostracized and would die. plain and simple. So no duh, we get these adrenaline rushes. We feel shame. We feel all these different ways when it comes to being ostracized from a group because our software is not built for this modern environment. Our brains, our internal systems have evolved so much slower than our surroundings. And so we are in quite literally a maladaptive environment. We are not well adapted to our environment because our biology does not change as rapidly as technology. We're just a blip, right, on this planet. And look what we've achieved with technology. The Industrial Revolution was like yesterday. The cotton gin and all these things was literally like a second ago, relative in history, probably even less than that. Yet our biology, our innate, I keep saying software, however you want to phrase it, it's ancient. And so we get these ancient signals and they map onto our modern situation. They map onto our modern brain. And these emotions can then be not necessarily just rationalized, but they can, what's the word I'm looking for? Infiltrate the conscious mind and cause a whole slew of things. It can cause anxieties, right? Because you are kicked off with an emotional state as the result of something happening. Say it's an exclusion from a group, to put it simply. And then your brain goes on and on and on and on, comes up with cognitive thoughts, rationales to what you did, why you did it, and it can ruminate and ruminate and ruminate. And I remember thinking that, hey, there's something wrong with me here. There's something wrong with the fact that I do this and that I care so much. Why do I care so much? Why am I so sensitive? Why am I like this? No one else around me is like this. What's wrong with me? People tell me, hey, you should just stop caring what other people think. And I thought for so long that there was something wrong with me. And I came to realize that these people just said that because they wanted to act tough. Or perhaps, sure, they were a little bit less sensitive, right? They were a little bit more resistant to the average stimulus than I was. I always, reference the mantis shrimp and how it has we can see so many different wavelengths of light, whereas we can't. I think a lot of ways that's some of the more sensitive humans among us. That's sort of what we have, is where we have more receptors in certain ways that make us, again, less resistant to stimuli. Like other people just don't see it at all. It's not that they can't, it's not that they don't understand or don't want to, they literally cannot. So all of that scientific information I found incredibly, incredibly helpful. I even took a course on beauty when it came to evolution and how, the color red is very useful for certain reasons, right? It not only triggers our alert system when it comes to danger, and as we know, a lot of toxic animals out there often have red coloration, whether it's certain butterflies or frogs, right? Like when it's really fluorescent coloring, that's a danger sign, and it's adaptive for them because all creatures know not to eat them, as well as a sign of, if we want to kind of dip our toe in that water for a hot second, the flushing of the face with red, or red lips, or anything like that, when you want to talk about fertility, whatever, and all that kind of sexual marketplace, as people love to discuss, and I'll talk about that maybe another day. So that was all helpful. It set a foundation for me where, all right, at baseline, I am an organism, and I am a creature of this earth, and I have evolved from years and years and years of my ancestors, and there are things that are ancient within me that are not wrong with me, but are already deeply wired, pre-programmed into my psyche. I guess I shouldn't say, I guess I can say psyche, but it's more so, I guess, the basal brain. I know people call it lizard brain or animalistic brain. I don't know if I love the connotation of that, but do with it what you will. So that's sort of, excuse me, really fundamental biology. And it was after this that it still isn't perfect, right? Because it started to get me into the mindset of things being predetermined, right? And this is sort of where we come back around to what I was talking about when it comes to Freud, Jung, and Adler. often Freud, and I guess sort of Jung, thinks about things in a deterministic way. And that's what I meant by etiology. Is etiology, if we're talking about it even from a medical perspective, it's finding the root cause. And that's what he would do. He would sort of root out what the situation was from your childhood. And in some ways, I took an etiological perspective, unintentionally so, when it came to figuring out what was wrong with me. I came to realize that my birth order had a lot to do with it. Obviously, a lot of evolution had a lot to do with it. Certain cooperation habits and cooperation, what's the word I'm looking for? Simulations that we would run in class taught me a lot about the ways that humans beings interact with one another and how my reactions were all various shades of valid. And so I fell into this world of, okay, science maps this. Like science tells me what I am. And I keep reiterating, I suppose, stability in that. But as much as it made me feel better about myself, it sort of diminished my sense of autonomy. Because instead of feeling as though I could manage my own destiny, I found myself more so legitimizing and validating my current situation based on things that happened in the past. I was so focused on finding the various sources of my various, I guess you could say, pathologies, if you want to be dramatic about it, or just various struggles that I had in life. And I think that can be fruitful and that can be helpful in some ways. And it's interesting in the self-help space, it's so clear. You see such a divide between those who want to focus on the psychoanalysis. They want to focus on the archetypes. They want to find out, all these things about who they are and their origin story and how that made them who they are. And others are kind of like, well, I don't care about that, right? Let's see where we can go from here. And that really is more so the Adlerian perspective is, well, does any of that really matter? And I think it's an in-between approach, like most things. It's a blend. And I think that I sort of fell too much so on that far side of thinking that it had all to do with my past. And I moved from the evolution space and the kind of archaic, scientific, ancestral space into the more nuclear family, developmentally. Again, this is more Freudian, figuring out what my family did in a lot of ways to make me who I am, or how I would typically phrase it, what I am. And that was helpful in, I suppose, elucidating various components of myself, right? That's just a fancy way of kind of saying the same thing I was saying before, that it helped me understand myself better. And it added the next layer, I would say, right? We talk about the evolution of the human brain, and we start with kind of the base when it comes to like the amygdala, the pons, the sort of really basic level of the brain that we share a lot with other species. And then you add the different layers until you get to the cortex, which does a lot of our cognition and more advanced processing. And I think in a lot of ways, the foundation of evolutionary psychology helped me establish the etiology of those more primal, that's the word I wanted, more primal instincts and reactions that I couldn't necessarily explain away via my cortex. And then you layer on top of that more emotions that, instead of feeling completely disassociated from my life, were associated with my life. It was my birth order. It was parental treatment. It was tendencies that I had as a kid relative to other interpersonal dynamics outside, inside the home, whatever you want to call it, that then maps onto who I am today. And I leaned on that a lot. And I think, not to say I've completely let go of it all, but there was a lot of emotion there, and realizing that those people are not perfect. And I think that can be difficult, especially if unintentionally so, they may present themselves that way because they have to, right? In order to what's the word I'm looking for? I guess inspire or prompt a child to do the thing that you want them to do, you need to come from a place of authority. And I think that especially, again, all of us are, maybe it sounds weird if I'm saying it, but we're all kids, like having kids. None of us are evolved and entirely matured. We're all always still figuring it out. And while kids are learning to walk and to read and make friends, like we're still learning how to do a lot of different things. I'm still learning how to make friends in the best way. I'm still learning how to, I don't know, best talk to people, manage myself, whatever it is. We're all still learning something. I have to learn on my job. And so I think their learning process, there wasn't a lot of wiggle room in regard to the utter confidence in which they shared information, I guess is the way I'll put it. And as a kid, you just take that to be infallible. I took them to be truth sayers. I took them to be the highest position of authority. And that was that. And so I believed, again, definitions about myself that may or may not have been true. And then that mapped into who I believed myself to be. And as I came into adulthood and relied more so on these, in a lot of ways, Freudian narratives that, these familial dynamics made me who I am, I lost a lot of that sense of control, and I felt powerless. And especially when you were dependent upon them in every which way, including financial, it is very difficult to separate yourself and separate your interests from their interests. It's very hard to diverge. And it's not until very recently that I have started in a really small way, but I'm trying my best to do that, to separate myself, at least psychologically. And a big part of that has been sort of this next phase of maybe self-actualization or just evolving, some evolution here, is recognizing that I do have more power than I think I do. That it's not just what they've done to me that has determined where I'm at. And not done to me in the purely negative sense, because obviously their discipline, their, I guess, encouragement, if I'd like to put it that way, got me a lot of things in this life. And I do not discount that. And I'm very grateful for it. And I'm grateful, honestly, for a lot of the life lessons, even if they initiated from a less than positive place. I have learned a lot from a young age, I would say. And it's helped me massively in life overall, as most lessons do. And so I explained away all of my successes to be the result of their pushing and their discipline, and it wasn't me. I still considered myself to be lazy, undisciplined, selfish, all of those labels that I had gotten, and then explained all of my positive things as, again, like parts of the situation that I was in, right? I was not a victim to the circumstances, but more so was a pawn in that game. And I felt as though I was not the player at all. I wasn't moving any of the pieces. And I think that all led to me feeling this way, that I had no agency, I had no control, and I really was just the result of my circumstances. And as I moved forward as an adult, I really thought that was going to be it. I was destined for certain things, and not to say that I wouldn't strive for others, but I would always use the framework of, well, what am I and how do I fit into this? And what do I have that makes, you know what I'm saying? Like, can I do this based on this preconception that I have, based on this sheet of comparisons that I have, this spreadsheet of who I think I am based on these narratives, who I've developed into based on what they've created me to be, like a sort of Frankenstein-y monster in some senses, just the amalgamation of how people have defined me and treated me. That's sort of how I looked at myself. And being more autonomous in my life now, no longer being a student in a lot of ways, I think it sort of prompted a necessary development in this arena. And I think that's why listening to a book like that was, one, something that intrigued me already from the title, but also as I listened to it further, it just, I guess, clicked in a way that it might not have before. I think I might have felt frustrated and disillusioned and disenfranchised if I had encountered it at a time when I couldn't have the courage to be disliked, right? That I couldn't focus on my psychological wellness per se. I couldn't focus on self-esteem or self-worth because I couldn't afford to, right? All of those things take an independent person in a lot of ways. It takes somebody who is not reliant upon others for safety, security, food, right? And so it's not to say that it's a luxury in the way that we often use the term luxury, but it is a luxury in that it is reserved for a select few who are in a particular place in life and are afforded a certain mentality. And it's not until very recently that I've sort of stepped into that. Again, not entirely. It's really just one toe. But I've started to do that, and it's been very interesting to look at it from this perspective, that it's the meaning I've assigned to all of those things that makes me who I am. And that it is a self-fulfilling prophecy. If I walk into a room and think I look ugly, I will act in a different way and will be perceived in such a way from other people that will reinforce the idea that I think I'm ugly. Even if they're not treating me badly because of how I look, my energy will just reflect that. It will reflect some sort of self-consciousness. And it's not, everyone talks about how everything is energy, and sure, and you could say that scientifically, spiritually, however, which way you want, but from an emotive sense as well, you can tell, right? When you walk in a room and there's tension, you feel it. The hair on your arms, it doesn't entirely stand up, but you can feel it rippling across your skin. And I think in a lot of ways, I've discussed this with my brother, that, speaking with other people and having that emotional catharsis, it really does something to you beyond the words. It does something on a deeper primal level. And I think that there's something to be said how your mindset then maps onto a different emotional state, like that of anxiety, which then translates to other people, not necessarily as that exact message that you were thinking, right? It doesn't translate into, oh, that person's ugly, but my ugliness makes my amygdala have this response, and then that response may or may not be elicited, or a similar one, or some sort of reactive emotional state can be elicited in that other person. And I think in the past I would have viewed it as blaming myself, right? Like I am the cause of all my misfortune. But I think being on the other side of going through that more scientifically oriented past, it's just completed the picture, or helped me, again, gain that agency back in a small way. And it was strange because after listening to this audiobook that really talks about community, it talks about contribution, it talks about really this teleology that it's all about the meaning you assign to circumstances, not the circumstances themselves that matters. I don't know. It certainly made me feel more empowered. And it was interesting that I consumed a bunch of media, I guess a fancy way of saying I watched a bunch of YouTube videos, and I had different narrators saying the same thing. There was this young 20-year-old kid who was running a multi-million-dollar business who is Christian and was talking about how the kingdom of heaven is in all of us. And he really relies and believes in the sort of same manifestation rhetoric, but he takes it from that religious standpoint that if the kingdom of heaven is in all of us, we are all divine beings, and we can make manifest whatever we would like. And that ties into the manifestation energy everyone talks about, right? The secret, all those types of things. And then on a podcast I was watching, there was a professor at a California school who had a PhD in, I believe, psychology. And he was talking about his research in both AI as well as just the concept of consciousness, and how he believes that consciousness was the origin of all things, and consciousness came before biology, which is still a difficult thing for me to get my head around as someone who tends more to be a biologist, not in the formal sense. And he really believes that we're all part of the same collective consciousness and are all just different avatars of the same thing. And again, it's funnily enough runs very much parallel to what that kid was saying about the kingdom of heaven and us being divine beings. And it interestingly maps onto, so Adler talks about cooperation being the most important thing and being of use to people. That's how one will find happiness. And of use, not in the entirely utilitarian sense of contributing something monetarily, materially, but just because someone loves you, you are of use to this world. And that's all you need to be. And finding, I guess, I don't want resoluteness. Is that even a word? Resolve in that, finding comfort in that, finding strength in that, and just being responsible for the tasks you need to do. I think he really focuses on that locus of control, but in a way that betters the world around you and has you bear responsibility for the collective because you are part of a collective. The most important thing to do is contribute to the community. You are one of a community. He wants you to view everyone around you as a comrade. It is, you lead with goodwill. You lead with the belief that they are there to help you, and you let them prove themselves otherwise. And it's so odd because that PhD psychologist really referenced that by saying, he has said that, I think his father was also in the clergy, and he said that you're like, love your neighbor as thyself because your neighbor is yourself. And it was just so bizarre that he said that. Adler was saying that in some fashion. This other kid was saying that we are all part of this like larger whole, and it's our job to, live out our potential in a lot of ways and contribute to society and improve it. And the way to be happy is through said contribution, but contributing can just be use. It can just be existing and in the fact that someone loves you means you're useful. And finding the solace, I suppose, is the word I wanted in that. And you could take that in a more productive context, like that kid, that we can all make manifest whatever we'd like, given that we are divine. You can take it in the communitarian context of either the Adlerian comrade perspective or, your neighbor is yourself. And I believe that's also a perspective in Hinduism, if I'm not mistaken, this concept of this overall consciousness or one-mindedness, I believe. But anyway, that's sort of where I'm at. That is the evolution of my mentality when it comes to, I guess, myself and my journey with seeing what I'm capable of, or discovering myself or my purpose or what I'm supposed to do. And it's not to say I, should jump from lily pad to lily pad and always believe the next guy or the next book that I listen to. But I think that this was a perspective I needed to hear, and it was missing from my, what's the word? Like highly, not just scientific, but I was very married to this perspective of scientific determinism, evolutionary determinism, that I was what I've been made to be. And I hadn't revisited the idea that I can co-create in that process, and I can become who I make myself to be, regardless of what those circumstances have done. Because even if those circumstances have weight, how I look at that weight is what impacts my life. It's not the weight itself. It's not what that person did to me. It's how I saw what that person did to me, how I metabolized what that person did to me. That is what matters. And so the meaning that I've assigned to all of these things, all of this past, all of the things that people have said to me, even the evolutionary perspective, the meaning that I have assigned to the fact that there's scientific basis for my feelings of potential social ostracization. Ostracize, right? So ostracization. Like all of that meaning has been co-created. Even if there was a kernel of scientific reality, I have an ability to change the map that gets imprinted on my brain. And that's a new strength, I think, that I'm trying to work with. It's not perfect. And it's a conscious effort every day walking into a room and trying to say to myself, my neighbor is myself. There's no reason for me to feel as though this person's going to judge me. I shouldn't feel nervous walking into a room because we all carry the same kernel of divinity or human dignity, right? And that's something that I guess as Adlerian too is our human dignity is not dependent upon our skill set. A child holds the exact same degree of dignity that an adult does. It doesn't matter if it can't tie its shoes, right? It has a task before it to eventually learn how to tie its shoes, and parents shouldn't be, too helicoptery and doing the tasks for said kid. It should be learning to self-actualize and come into its own and be the purest self that it can, right? And that again comes into the whole courage to be disliked, whether it's self-made manifest because you have the kingdom of heaven within you. If you're a child of God, they only refer to children of things as the same organisms, right? The kid of a fox is a fox. And so there's that reference too. We all have this responsibility to be our authentic selves and contribute uniquely because there's nobody out there who is us. While your neighbor is yourself and that they contain the same essence of the universe, of the soul, of spirituality, of one-mindedness, however you want to put it, you have a uniqueness as well. You are a different avatar, and your imprint on this world is different as a result of that. And so, given the fact that you have just as much legitimacy, the same core essence as the person next to you, regardless of life experience, how can you not make a difference in this world? How can you not impart your wisdom, your life experience, your inner world onto the outer world? Because no matter who you are were born unique. That just is reality. And you have just as much of a reason to share, to be vocal, or not if you decide not to. That's your prerogative as well, and that might be part of your programming. But this is really, I guess, for all those who are maybe afraid to say things or be, right? To I don't necessarily love the phrase take up space, but yeah, to even occupy space, I suppose is the way I'd rather put it. To even just be there, to just exist there. For those that are afraid to do that, I think it's helpful to take a look at, one, what you can control about the narratives that you tell yourself. And sure, you can look at the etiology and maybe where it came from, but you can take that source, but just remember that the source is the meaning you assign to it. It's not what they did to you. It's what you decided they did to you. And it's not to say that, right, like there's some things that are factual. Someone say, tripped you or did not trip you, but you can take different meanings from that. You can take it as a sign that, okay, maybe that person is someone I don't want to cooperate with. I've learned my lesson there. You can take it as, okay, maybe these shoes are too big, or I should watch my step next time that I'm around somebody who presents in a similar way to them, right? You can take it as a lesson, or thank goodness that I know that this person is willing to trip me because I'm not going to let them, kick me in the future, right? Like you can prevent escalation, or you could just fall on your face and then chastise yourself and say that you're embarrassed and you should have known, and wow, everyone's thinking about me, and oh my goodness, like what a loser, and blah, 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 blah. You can just take it in very different ways. So even though there's the reality of an act, how that act carries forward with you in life once the reality is gone, once the past has dissipated into nothing more than a memory, even if it happened a second ago. It's the meaning you carry with you into the present that influences your life. It is not the act itself. And yeah, that's coupled with our individual divinity, I think is just something important. And it's something that I'm trying to, as you can tell, metabolize and digest and integrate into my self-concept to make my life a little bit easier and to reduce the activation energy that I find is required for me every time I step into a room. Every time. I always would think something's coming at me, and to make myself shrink. I'm too loud, and then I'm too quiet, and then I'm too this, and then I'm too that. I'm just wrong. I'm always wrong. That sensation of wrongness. If anyone else has felt that way, I would just implore you to, I mean, it sounds stupid, but believe otherwise or know otherwise. Because you are no different than any other human being. In regard to your dignity, in regard to your legitimacy to just exist. Thank goodness you exist. There's no one else that is you. There's no one else that is you. You're the only one with the kernel of the divine or the kernel of life force or the avatar housing the consciousness. You are coloring it a beautiful new color. And your color is just as legitimate as anybody else's. So don't let other people tell you otherwise, and don't let yourself tell you otherwise. Don't let science tell you otherwise. And I think for a while that's what I've been doing, is I've been leaning on scientific principles to tell me, you know, I'm one of a gazillion, I'm stardust. And while that can be liberating in some ways and take off the responsibility, I think always living in that mentality can leave one adrift in a black hole of existentialism, nihilism, whatever you want to say. Just listlessness of lack of importance and lack of purpose. Because if I am just stardust and the weird kind of chronological result of weird science going, like, you know, exploding one thing after another and then adapting to various things over and over again, and then the bloom of oxygen in the atmosphere, whatever you want to call it. If I am just that, then what am I? Because our primal brain maybe could deal with that, but our consciousness, our cognitive brain, this, I don't want to say higher level of thinking, but I suppose, I just don't like the hierarchy, you know, between ourselves and other organisms, but that's a different story. And I don't want to lose anybody to potentially more woo-woo topics, but yeah, you are valid the way you are. And those things can be used as tools, as leverage. However, we are the only species that we know of, which again, I don't necessarily know if it's entirely true, but the only species that we know of that has consciousness in this way. And so don't disqualify yourself from the collective. Don't disqualify yourself from the contribution that you will, by virtue of your substance, of what you are. Don't discount yourself. Remember what you are. You are a child of the universe, as you want to call it, a child of the great mind, consciousness. There's the Gaia hypothesis too. We're all part of the same life force, whatever you want to say. You are that. You are that divine being. Kingdom of heaven, however you want to put it, is within each of us. You are the avatar and avatar of the infinite, So act like it. You are no less than anybody else. And it's going to take time to let that affect your behavior, as it's still trying to happen for me, and real life gets in the way, and that primal brain of ours will get in the way. Anxiety, anger, sadness, embarrassment, shame, guilt, they will all try to cloud that judgment and that, I guess, vibrational state of collectivity. It will try to breed, I guess, not just scorn, but it will try to breed disagreement and antagonism and conflict between yourself and other avatars of the consciousness. And that just is, I think, the combination of our animalistic evolutionary ways and our more philosophical, quote unquote, elevated thinking ways. And so it's growing pains, right? We have to adapt at some point to this growing environment, this dynamic, progressive environment. And it's an ongoing process. So hopefully you followed me through this, and I appreciate you listening. I hope that there will be more to come. And if you have any recommendations or suggestions, I would happily take those. And we're just learners, I guess. We're just students of the universe. And so be well, take care, and I will, I guess, see you next time. Talk to you next time. Bye-bye.